I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast Supplement. Rob, why is this Chinese Literature Podcast Supplement different from all other supplements?
My awesomeness quotient is higher?
Incorrect. This is a very special Passover edition of the Chinese Literature Podcast Supplement.
Wait a minute, Lee. Wait a second. This is nuts here. A Passover edition. We're a Chinese literature podcast, man.
That's
correct. What's with the Passover thing?
So a lot of people don't realize this, and Rob, you may be the, I think it's the ignorant child or the dumb child that's referred to in the Haggadah.
I'm fine with that.
Should I be the wise child or the evil child?
Evil, definitely evil.
So a lot of people don't realize this, but Jews actually, there were a large number of Jews, a relatively large number of Jews in China for a while. They probably came before 1300, according to kind of linguistic analysis of the language that they used. And they almost certainly came during the Song dynasty because the longest remaining synagogue was in Kaifeng, which is today just kind of a backwater in Henan. But in the northern Song dynasty, Rob, as I'm sure you know, that was the capital. That was a big deal.
It was a big deal, yeah. And we should also point out before we go too much further in the history, we are recording this during Passover week, which was the specific inspiration for this. I do actually know a little bit. I'm not totally ignorant.
Rob, you've been to a Seder at our house, right?
I have. I remember that. That was like the first year you were here, right?
I think so, yeah.
My second or third year.
Yeah,
that
your
was really,
second year.
Yeah, it was really fun.
So we should point out that neither you nor I are Jewish. We're both goy, but my wife is Jewish, and so we have this. I have this kind of connection to the chosen people, and that's why we chose to do a Passover podcast.
That's it. So as you mentioned, the Jews actually have a fairly long history in China. They have not thrived the same way that some of the other faiths have in the 20th century, after Mao anyway. Christianity and, well, really Buddhism really are the biggest ones and the biggest growing ones for various cultural and logistical reasons, maybe. Judaism and Islam don't tend to spread as fast.
Well, that's not quite true. Islam has done relatively well in China. I mean, you don't think of China as an Islamic space. It actually has more Muslims than Saudi Arabia.
Well, that's of course a percentage thing because there's
sure,
so freaking many Chinese
1% of 1.5 billion people is a lot of.
I think I think about Ian Johnson's book. You and I both read The Souls of China, and one of the things he talks about is that Judaism and Islam in particular tend to get passed down through families, not really through proselytization, by which evangelism, heading out with missionaries to spread the word. There are Muslim missionaries, of course, but it functions a little differently in China. So those tend to be compared to Buddhists and Christians and to some extent, even a larger extent, sort of native religions, sort of small scale, don't have as many numbers. But the Jews have a very, very long history in China.
More than 1,000 years, yeah.
More than 1,000 years. And so, Lee, you mentioned the Haggadah. Tell our listeners, because I actually didn't know what this was until you said you wanted to talk about it. So tell us what it is.
So the Haggadah is a text that's read during Seders, which Seders are conducted on the first 2 nights of Passover, the week-long celebration. And the book that we're talking about, this supplement, is the Haggadah of the Kaifeng Jews of China. And the authors are Fook-Kong, Wong, and Dalia Yasharpour. Sorry, my Hebrew is not quite as good as my Cantonese, although my Cantonese is pretty bad as well.
I was about to say that's a rough comparison.
And what's fascinating about this book is it gives a really in-depth analysis of the 2 extant Haggadahs that are from Kaifeng. So we mentioned that there were Jews all over China. They came in probably in the 8th, 9th, 10th century. And the last remaining group of Jews that were still kind of functioning until the 1640s were in Kaifeng, the former northern Song capital. And what's fascinating is this Haggadah is actually, it was bought, I think, in like 1850. Or I'm sorry, these two Haggadahs were bought in 1850 by the London Missionary Society, and now they reside at Hebrew University in Cincinnati. So
Hebrew Union College, actually.
I'm sorry, thank you. Hebrew Union College. Hebrew University is in Israel. What did you think of this text? It's very much a kind of insider baseball thing, which we do, but it's not our baseball
Very
game,
much
right?
so. This book that writes about the Haggadah in Kaifeng, as Lee mentions, a little bit insider baseball, but it is very, very interesting for looking at just how international religion is in China. It gives a really interesting analysis, for example, of how scribes used their own Chinese language to sort of inflect how the Hebrew was written and recited. How the names were transliterated, how the pauses were done. So even before the Chinese Jews in China, well, Chinese Jews in China, of course they're in China, have their own particular identity, they're already using their own language to inflect how this is done. And that's a really interesting thing to see. I'm familiar with Chinese Bibles, of which there are many and many different kinds, but and you can probably say a little more about this, but there are a lot more rules in Judaism and Islam as well on how you're allowed to transmit holy texts. The Bible tends to be a lot more flexible. So even with the Chinese inflections, the scholars who wrote this book remark it's pretty faithful to the original.
Yeah, it's fascinating because they're based off of the textual evidence, they conclude that the Hebrew that's being used in this book is highly inflected by the local Chinese vernacular of Kaifeng. And so we should mention what language this Haggadah is written in. So first off, it's written in, the Haggadah has to be written in Hebrew. It's always conducted, the ritual itself is always conducted in Hebrew. But they also oftentimes have notes. So, when you and I sat down for our Seder, that Haggadah was in English and Hebrew and a transliterated version of Hebrew that was written in English, that kind of functions as a pronunciation guide. What's fascinating is this Haggadah is written in Hebrew, but it's also written in a language called Judeo-Persian, which is just Persian language, so that's the language of Iran, but written in Hebrew letters. So the dominant tradition, at least in this community, was coming from Central Asia, from the area near Iran today, and coming as traders and merchants, and they wound up in Kaifeng when it was a big city.
And, of course, picking up the various languages along the way. I mean, Persian would have been obviously used along the Silk Road, and anyone going towards Kaifeng is going to encounter traders using it. The whole text analyzes, when I say the whole text, I mean the book we're talking about, analyzes two versions of the Haggadah, or two manuscripts they found, with various degrees of changes. I wanted to point out one thing, Lee, and I wanted to see what you thought of this. One of the manuscripts, and I'm not going to go all the way back and figure out exactly which one because no one's going to remember anyway, talks about a lot of the Hebrew characters, or a lot of the lines, at least in the Chinese as well, being rendered into 7-character phrases or into a block. Did you notice that too?
I know where you're going with this, but when I first read that, I did not think of that.
See, when I first saw it, I thought, oh, well, that's Tang Dynasty poetry. Like or not even Tang Dynasty. This would have been maybe perhaps gathered during the Song, which also makes sense because some of these poetry forms are very old. But the Jueju classical poetry form had regular 7-character lines. And I find that detail fascinating because it indicates perhaps even while maintaining the original text, they were still trying to organize it according to a familiar style of poetry specifically, which meant it wasn't supposed to be just a guidebook that everyone picked up and recited. It was something with meaning. It was something with power, beauty, not just a thing you recited together.
Yeah, I don't know if I would go that far. I think you may be reading a little too much into this, or at the very least,
I think you're reading too little.
It's the first time that I've read too little and you've read too much into something. Yeah, I think it is a fascinating possibility, but it's just impossible to say whether Chinese forms of poetry are influencing the way this text is being written or not. And the scholars who wrote this book did not say that, so I think I would hate to jump to a conclusion.
Good point. Although I do still think it's interesting.
This community was sort of discovered, so to speak. They were in the 1600s. It was a small but thriving community of Jews in Kaifeng. And one of them went up to Beijing, I believe, to take the imperial exam, if I remember correctly. He ran into one of the Catholic missionaries, Matteo Ricci. He had heard about Ricci because there was some connection. He thought that
you believe also in just one God and not many gods, and you do not worship the emperor. That's very interesting. You must be a Jew.
He was like, "Oh, and you're not Muslim, therefore you must be a Jew," because there really aren't any other.
Right, there's no other options.
As far as he knew, that was true. So this community was fairly cut off from the rest of the Jewish community at this time, but they still they were just kind of stumbled upon by Catholic missionaries. Unfortunately, in the Ming-Qing transfer, the Ming government, which eventually lost, of course, flooded much of Kaifeng, and there are reports that in this flooding of Kaifeng, which they were trying to stop a peasant rebellion, they flooded the synagogue along with the rest of the city, and only some of the text, the Hebrew text that we have today, remain. And if I remember correctly, these Haggahs had some water damage on them.
Yeah, they talk about that in the book.
That was kind of the beginning of the end for the Jewish community of Kaifeng. We don't really know what happened to a lot of them, but many of them actually converted to Islam. Because if you think about it, there's a continuity between their tradition and the Islamic tradition. They don't eat pork, they worship one God, and they were able to in terms of their Jewishness, they weren't able to maintain a rabbi and a synagogue, but with the community of Muslims there, which was much larger, they were able to kind of merge into that.
Although, and it's interesting because the fact that there are still Jews in China at all is pretty remarkable, given that disaster. Right? This has to be a fairly tenacious group in order to hang on this long. Because, as you said, when your place of worship that we know of, really the only major synagogue in China, certainly at the time, gets wiped out and most of your text lost, that's supposed to be pretty much sayonara, but they're still here.
They kind of disappeared largely for 200 years and converted, like I said, mostly to Islam. But today there is actually a small community, I believe, of about 2,000 Jews in Kaifeng who were able to figure out their Jewish heritage based off of last names and kind of family histories. And they've sort of reemerged in China today, although it's my understanding that recently Xi Jinping's campaign against non-Chinese religions has kind of cut down on the acceptable activities that they can engage in.
Is that the Jews as well? I was thinking for some reason Xi's policies were more geared towards the big religions, the ones that were really spreading quickly, rather than small ones that he didn't think were of any quote-unquote
They
threat.
are geared towards the big religions, but there has been concern that Jews are also, because they're a foreign religion, they're perceived as a foreign religion at least. I mean, as we talked about, they've been in China for not quite as long as Buddhism has, but still more than 1,000 years. So there is concern that increasingly the space for expression of religion that's perceived as non-Chinese is closing, and that apparently has affected many of the Kaifeng Jews.
I think we should start wrapping it up here. We're getting towards the end of our time.
Like the Seder, this podcast has gone on much longer than it should, and Rob is already starting to get hungry.
I remember that actually. I thought it was a very interesting and at times beautiful ceremony. But there was a point where you're like, "Are we going to eat more than?"
As my wife said, Judaism involves a lot of eating, but a lot of talking before you eat.
Yeah, which is a good way to put it. The book we're talking about is, as Lee said, it's pretty dense going. It was definitely not written for a general audience. Having said that, it's very tightly structured. Introduction, here's what I'm going to do, points, evidence, conclusion. So it's very easy to follow. So if you find yourself interested in this history, you can pick it up, and even if you can't follow all the linguistics and sort of the inside of baseball,
which we were not able to follow much of this.
No, but even then, there's enough history and cultural context to make it a really interesting read.
I think that's a great place to end it, Rob. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast Supplement.